Oh, we have a guest with us in this morning to talk about something that has really captivated thoughts and ideas across the country. A group of 9 elected prosecutors have formed a coalition aimed at holding federal agents accountable if they exceed their lawful authority. Here to talk to us is one of the people on that group, Norfolk Commonwealth's attorney, Ramin. Fatehi, thank you so much for being here.
Eugene, it's great to be here this morning. Thanks for having me.
So you're calling this group Fight Against Federal Overreach, FAFO. Tell us a little bit about what you all aim to do and why you felt like this was something you needed to form.
Well, we as prosecutors, all of us are ministers of justice. We are here to protect our citizens from violence, no matter who commits violence. And one of the touchstones for me as a progressive prosecutor and as Commonwealth's attorney in Norfolk has been that everybody gets the same brand of justice, rich, poor, black, white. Everybody is held to the same legal standard and nobody is above the law. And that means whether somebody committing an act of violence is a hardened gang member or, heaven forbid, is a law enforcement officer, the law applies to them equally. That is a principle that has been under consistent attack at the federal level. We've seen a level of lawlessness, violence, and enabling behavior that's come from President Trump on down to federal law enforcement, and especially ICE and the Border Patrol. And the surges that we've seen in places like Portland, Los Angeles, and especially Minneapolis are state-sanctioned violence against not just undocumented immigrants, but against immigrants, naturalized citizens, and naturally born American citizens. A group of us came together and said, what can we do to stand up? What can we do to use the powers of the state system to push back on federal lawlessness? And that's where the Project to Fight Federal Overreach, FAFO, was born. I got a call, 3 Sundays or so ago from Larry Krasner, one of the leading progressive prosecutors in the United States, the DA in Philadelphia. And Larry said, Ramin, I'm making some telephone calls. We're trying to pull a group together. And the purpose of the group is going to be ready to, in case Minneapolis happens in our cities, and Mary Moriarty, who's my friend, as Larry is, who's the county attorney in Minneapolis, he said, Mary's going to be part of this. And I said, absolutely, count me in. And 9 of us came together. Now, there are 2,300 elected prosecutors in the United States. I think it says something that there are 9 of us in this group, as far as both how afraid people are to stand up and the way that the rule of law has been under attack. But 9 of us came together and we're ready to do the things that we need to do.
And one of those 9 also in Hampton Roads, Stephanie Morales out of Portsmouth, the Commonwealth's attorney there. And I was going to ask you if the group has grown since. It seems like it's still at the 9 elected officials currently. So let's talk about Minneapolis, because this announcement came after both the deaths of Renee Good, who we now know ties to Norfolk, graduated from Old Dominion University, and then Alex Preddy as well. This announcement comes after that. We also are looking at the situation where federal officials saying they're not going to be sharing some of the information when it comes to evidence with the state and local prosecutors there also. How would this group, in you all's estimation, respond to a situation like that? Either, let's say, put you all in Minneapolis, or if it were to happen here or elsewhere, how would this group respond to that?
That's a great question. The violence in Minneapolis touched everybody in the United States, but it especially touched Norfolk with Renee's death. My wife teaches at Old Dominion. Renee was in my wife's department. My wife's colleagues were her teachers. In fact, this Sunday at 2 p.m. to 9 p.m., there's going to be a benefit at Elation Brewing on Colley Avenue to try and fund a scholarship in Renee's name at Old Dominion. It's something that I'm not sure why, but apparently the Old Dominion administration's not supporting. But there are going to be faculty and friends who are working on it. So I encourage people to remember that Renee is from Norfolk and she's a daughter of Norfolk, and that she didn't need to die the way she did. What we saw in Minneapolis was more of the world turned upside down, that the guardians of civil rights are now the violators of civil rights. And a lot of the work that Mary Moriarty has done in Minneapolis is actually modeled on work that we're doing here in Virginia. 4 years ago, in Fairfax County, my colleague Steve Toscano, the Commonwealth's attorney, indicted 2 park police officers for shooting into a car for a motorist, a man named Bijan Qaisar. And Steve had to fight that case in federal court. He had the backing of Mark Herring in that fight. And then when Mark Herring lost the election to Jason Miyares folded and dumped the case, which he never should have done. And Steve's case died on the vine for lack of support from a Republican attorney general who called himself Mr. Law and Order. But a lot of the motions practice that Steve had worked on were templates that Mary used. Mary's work and the way that she's had to adapt to the resistance from federal officials is going to be a template for us. The 8 of the 9 of us who were able to make it met in Washington a couple of Fridays ago to discuss strategy. And we have a plan. So if something like this happens in Norfolk, we will have injunctions to file in federal court that day to preserve evidence and to preserve the crime scene. We will have orders to ask federal judges to require cooperation. We will have coordination with state and local law enforcement, where if they won't let us into a crime scene, we're going to set up a secondary crime scene cordon around the federal crime scene so that we know what's coming in and what's going out. We will be on scene. I've pledged and I have gone to every officer involved shooting in Norfolk personally. I will be there at one of these shootings if they, heaven forbid, happen. And then we will have to engage in some very serious and very difficult litigation in court, both to get the evidence and, if we bring indictments, to be able to continue those cases for trial without having them dismissed. And that's a whole nother problem.
And that's what's going to be my follow-up. How difficult is what you're talking about for local, state officials? We're seeing the tension with the federal officials there in Minnesota and Minneapolis. How difficult is what you're talking about to actually do?
Extremely, and it's difficult. It's extremely difficult on purpose. The laws that govern federal immunity, or the immunity of federal officials for prosecution for state crimes, were set up mainly during Jim Crow and during the fight over Brown versus Board of Education and the integration of schools. So it's civil rights movement era stuff. And those laws were set up to prevent Bull Connor from arresting FBI agents and throwing them into kangaroo court in Alabama for enforcing integration. So they are difficult on purpose. And we now live in a world where the cry of states' rights, that was the cry of racists and segregationists, is now the cry of people who are trying to preserve people's civil rights. This is not good. It's not normal. I never thought I'd have to do this. But those rules are hard. And what they mean is, if I bring an indictment for murder, let's say, against a federal official, assuming that I've been able to get the evidence, which that's what all of the earlier motions practice would do, and the coordination with local and state law enforcement to try and bring evidence to the table, crowdsourcing, public portals for videos, just like we've seen it with Renee Good and Alex Preddy's shootings and killings. The availability of evidence from citizens is going to be absolutely crucial. But the rule basically is, if you're a federal official indicted for a state crime, you're entitled to have your trial in federal court. So my prosecutors and I would be in federal court trying this based on state law. But there's also immunity. And the standard for immunity is very favorable to federal officials. If they were doing their job but doing it wrong, they're immune. The way that we would be able to go to court is if we can show that they were so out of bounds with what they were doing, let's say multiple shots to the back of a helpless person, that what they were doing was no longer their job. And that this isn't going to cover general police brutality. It absolutely doesn't cover cruelty or, ice sweeps where they shouldn't be going. we're not talking about disagreements over execution of their lawful functions. We lost an election, that's why we have to win the next elections. This is about actual crimes. But I got to tell you, the meeting that we had in Washington, it has me prepared and will have my trial team prepared. We met with the lawyer who was the lead prosecutor on the Tree of Life Synagogue case, one of the lead prosecutors in prosecuting Derek Chauvin for killing George Floyd, and tried that case in federal court and defended his conviction in the federal appeals courts. It was some of the most intellectually demanding information that I've dealt with in years. But we understand what our duties are. And finally, we have money on the table. We have money in a lockbox that has been pledged for us to be able to hire lawyers, not for anything else, only if we wind up in these situations and we have to litigate in federal court, so that we can bring in the top lawyers in the country to ensure that we can have justice. So you asked about expanding the group. I've already talked with more than one prosecutor in Virginia who's prepared to join the group. We will have an admissions process so that 9 will grow. But that money that I told you about will be available to anybody who has a federal official that they're prosecuting, because we want to make sure that there's justice no matter who's in the group or not.
And 2 quick follow-ups on the 2 sentences you just said. On the first hand of that, when you say available to anyone, that includes even those who may be on a different side of the aisle than you as well, correct? Or in terms of working with them. And then the other question that I have for you is on that number. You say that you've reached out to a few, and there are a few who are ready to join in. But earlier you said there were 2,300 or so elected prosecutors across the country. Why do you think only 9 so far have been willing to join this group?
Fear. Nobody wants to take on the Justice Department. They've got 11,000 lawyers. They have the power of the federal government. They've got President Trump's bully pulpit. And if we've seen anything out of the second Trump administration, it is that people we thought have courage will fold. The law firms folded. Universities folded. Civil society organizations folded. Even though they were legally in the right, people just folded. And frankly, I just think that a lot of our colleagues are scared. And that is shameful. It's shameful because we are ministers of justice. We're elected officials. We need to stand up. But I think some of it is also that even people who aren't scared, they don't know where to start. And somebody's got to start, and somebody's got to be the first one to step up. And I'm proud to be one of the 9 out of 2,300 who stepped up. That's the trust that I asked Norfolk's voters to put in me, and I consider it my moral duty to do it. And what I'll say, what we've seen with Trump is the law firms folded until Mark Elias stood up, and Perkins Coie stood up and sued him. The universities folded until Harvard stood up. And when Harvard said, no more, we're taking you to court, this is wrong, that made a difference. And I think that what we will see is when we as prosecutors, enforcers of the criminal law stand up, that first of all, the Trump administration starts to back off, and second, other people find backbones, and more people will stand up and stand with us.
When you're talking about working with people from all various sides of this, in your estimation, how could it also help for those who are maybe not more, either democratic or progressive in their approach? In your estimation, this is something that can also help people who are conservatives and find themselves in a similar situation.
Absolutely. There's no ideological litmus test for assistance from our organization. The only question is, do you have a federal law enforcement officer who's committed a crime? Do you feel that your evidence supports an indictment, and are you prepared to prosecute? If the answers to those 3 questions are yes, then our organization will sit down and will decide whether we have money on the table to provide to that person for the work that they are trying to do. We're one of the most toxic and evil things that has come out of the Trump administration is the suggestion that blue states deserve different treatment, blue cities deserve different treatment. We're not going to say red states and red cities deserve different treatment. Everybody deserves to feel safe. I don't ask a victim what their political affiliation is. They're victims. I don't ask a defendant what his political affiliation is. He's a defendant. That's what matters. And so if it comes to the inner circle, as we're making sort of strategy decisions for ourselves, we obviously want people who we get along with, we understand, and we know. But we'll offer help to anybody who has a meritorious case, and even if it's the only thing we agree on, we're absolutely going to be prepared to help.
And my kind of last question here is, how would you judge the success of this? What are you looking at, as yourself in getting into this? You look at it maybe 2-3 years down the line, and you say this was successful. How would you define it?
I think that success in the world of criminal law and crime suppression is measuring the dog that doesn't bark. That's really hard to do, and it's often difficult to know whether one thing or another causes crime not to happen. I deal with that in my everyday work. But I think that different measures of success here would be, do we see a moderation in the violence and over-the-top nature of immigration enforcement? We're never going to see the Trump administration be anything but the Trump administration. But as long as they're not shooting people without cause, cracking people's skulls without cause, that could be a sign of improvement. If, heaven forbids, there is an indictable case, a successful trial, a defeat of the immunity claims, and presuming that the evidence was there, a conviction and accountability would also be a mark of success. But also the coming together of additional prosecutors from around the country, and a demonstration that we're patriots. We believe in the Constitution. We actually don't think it's words on paper that you can ignore at your convenience. That an increasing push, in an upside-down world where the states are actually the supporters of equality and civil rights as the federal government has started to deteriorate. I'd call that success too.
And one more here. There are critics who might say what you're doing and what your team is doing would escalate the already tenuous relationship between federal and state and local officials. What do you say to them?
I think those are the same people who say that we're supposed to talk tough to gangsters and they're supposed to not commit crimes. Would it make sense for me to say, if you're in a gang, we're going to prosecute you, and then have people say, well, that's just going to make the gangs more violent? That makes sense, right? Now, it doesn't make sense in this context either. The only difference being that I think that the average federal agent and the average federal agency is paying more attention to deterrence than the average gang member is. So, no. I said it before and I'll say it again. We're not here to prosecute ICE agents for arresting undocumented immigrants or for being jerks or for doing things that are counterproductive or inhumane or, frankly, even civilly illegal. That's not what this is about. They have the right to do that, as awful and counterproductive as I think it is. It is about crimes. And anybody who says, well, you're inviting more crime by saying you're going to punish crime is either not thinking about it or talking out of both sides of his mouth.
All right, this is Ramin Fatehi. You're going to stick around here. We're going to have much more. We got to take a quick break. Stick with us here as we're talking about this new group that's been formed, but also getting a little bit of insight into a case that now involves an international manhunt. We'll be right back in about 2 minutes. We are back here for Live Impact News. Thank you so much for sticking with us here on 13 News Now Plus and YouTube Live. We have with us Norfolk Commonwealth's attorney, Ramin Fatehi. We were talking about this new coalition that he is a part of, along with Portsmouth Commonwealth's attorney, Stephanie Morales, and 7 other prosecutors from across the country to hold federal agents accountable in cases of misconduct. One more question I needed to ask you here on the other side of this is there is the difference between federal charges and state charges which come into play in this situation from what you all are trying to do with FAFO.
Absolutely, Eugene. One of the biggest weapons that Donald Trump has wielded in both Trump 1.0 and 2.0 is his power to pardon people. And, he may have been misusing that power, but everything he's done is completely legal. He can pardon whoever he wants, whenever he wants, but only for federal crimes. So the really important part about us as state prosecutors is if we bring a state charge and we secure a state conviction, just like Alvin Bragg did against Trump himself, you can't pardon it. And that means that they do not have Trump's shield of protection for the state crime of murder, for example. You get convicted on that, you're going to prison, and Trump can't spring you.
Well, let's transition to a case that is currently happening here in Norfolk that now is turning into an international manhunt. I'm talking about the case of Lina Guerra. She was a woman found dead inside of an apartment freezer earlier this month, and now her husband, David Varela, a 38-year-old Navy Reserve service member, is believed to be on the run international. And the attempts right now is to get him for this particular case. Ramin, obviously this is something that is going to be across your desk with all of this. What can you tell us just from the basic information first of what you know about this case and where you guys are in the investigation?
I've known about this case basically from its inception, and the night that the police were searching Lina's apartment, I was actually in Washington for the meeting of FAFO. But I got a telephone call about it and knew that the police were looking for her and had my lawyers there as I am at every homicide scene if I'm not out of town, and as we are on every scene, period. I have to be really careful about talking about the facts for two reasons. One, we want to see David Varela arrested, and if I talk too much, I could jeopardize the ability to bring him to justice. The other is that as a prosecutor in Virginia, ethically, I have a duty to make sure that Mr. Varela has a fair trial, and as fair as possible. And that means that I'm not allowed to talk about the facts of pending cases. We do our talking in court and in court filings. But I know that you have filings from the federal court, so I know that a good number of the facts are out there.
Yeah, I'll read some of those because I know you can't talk about it, so that's perfectly fine. But so just make sure everybody understands a timeline of this. Her family, Lina Guerra's family, which are in Colombia, they had reported her missing in January after they hadn't contacted her for weeks, which was not normal. February 5th, police executed a search warrant at their apartment in Norfolk and found her body in a freezer. Autopsy later confirmed that this was a homicide. So flash forward, now we have the charges of first-degree murder and concealing a dead body against her husband, David Varela. You're looking at him right there. But we also have information now that we've been reporting that investigators believe that he fled to Hong Kong around the same time of Guerra's body being discovered. There are multiple agencies we know who have been in on this case, working to try to obviously find him and bring him to justice so that he can see his day in court. Certainly the family is wanting some answers to this. Ramin, this is where I can bring you back into this case. Again, not speaking maybe to the specifics of this, but with that information, if it is in fact true that he has been able to flee to Hong Kong, there are some potential barriers when it comes to the U.S. China had a former agreement when it came to bringing people back in, if they were the final extradition. Where does that stand now? And as a prosecutor, can you speak to both the international maybe challenges of what it looks like when you're working with international police and other agencies, and then also the challenges specific to maybe China or Hong Kong?
Yes, I'd be glad to, Eugene. I'm really proud of my team in my office. We're 42 lawyers, we're 50 staff, and the work that we've done on this particular case, a lot of which won't come to light until after there's a trial, but it shows that we can walk, chew gum, and juggle at the same time, and that a case that would completely paralyze a lesser office or would consume all of the resources, we handle it. And we handle it well. I have been a prosecutor now for 19 years. I've been a prosecutor both at the state and the federal level. This is only the second time in my career that we have had to involve an international arrest warrant, that we've had to file what's known as an Interpol Red Notice. Interpol being the umbrella organization by which the police departments of 190-some countries cooperate. The last one that I did was in 2011, and it involved extraditing somebody who had engaged in child exploitation from Italy. And I was with the Justice Department in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Charlottesville. That case went up to the Italian Supreme Court because the man fought extradition. He's currently in prison. In an American prison. We got him back. But this process is also difficult on purpose. The Interpol is a consortium. They exchange information. It's a clearinghouse, but they carry out. They don't do the actual rubber meeting the road. That is, in the U.S., it's people like the FBI or state or local police or their equivalents in foreign countries. But Interpol, covering 190-some countries, covers countries that are very free and countries that are very unfree, places that are authoritarian and places that are democratic. And there are safeguards in place that make extradition difficult by design, so that, for example, the United States government or the Canadian government can't be used as muscle to enforce laws to oppress religious minorities, political dissidents, folks who would be engaging in conduct that would not be considered a crime in the country where they have sought refuge or where they may be found. So it is hard on purpose. What that means for us, and for example, in the case that I handled in Charlottesville, which is closed, and so I can talk more freely now. In that case, the suspect had been arrested on the Blue Ridge Parkway. Evidence had revealed that he had been sexually abusing an underage girl, and during the course of the investigation, he had been living in Louisiana, but he was working on oil rigs off the coast of Nigeria. And he suffered a medical emergency while at a layover in the airport in Rome. And that's how he wound up in Italy. And wound up in an Italian jail for close to a year as we litigated getting him back. But the paperwork that we had to put together had to show the Italian government that the charge was legitimate, that there was evidence to support the charge, that the crime would be a crime in Italy and not just in the United States, that that wasn't a case where the death penalty would have been applicable. We had to say what the maximum punishments were. We had to certify that we were not going to seek the death penalty, for example. And there was still due process rights in the Italian courts for that man. In this case, we have had to follow those similar procedures. We have had to provide the information to Interpol, what the facts were as we see it, what the charges were. I consulted with the Norfolk Police Department, and we agreed, for example, to file the charge of first-degree murder up front. Normally, that is something that we do following, or we do at indictment. Customarily, even if we think we're going to proceed on a first-degree murder, in Norfolk and in most cities around here, the charge starts out as second-degree murder. However, having dealt with the changes in charges, that can often reset the entire process with Interpol. I discussed with the Norfolk Police, let's bring the most serious charges so that we can certify to the receiving government and bring the person back.
And the understanding is that murder here would also still be considered murder in China in that case. That's also a crime that they would have as well, to your point earlier. It's
probably the only crime in the world that's universal. It's obviously there are different ways of proving it, different defenses, different grades, but murder is murder all over the world. It's been that way since Cain killed Abel.
Facts for that. But specifically, if you can, you just talked about your experience in working with Interpol and these international agencies, but from the specifics to China and Hong Kong, I reference the extradition treaty that we had. I believe it was suspended a few years ago, 2020. How does that factor into this, if you're able to talk about that?
I can talk in general terms.
Yeah.
Countries govern their extradition. There are agreements to swap, criminals back and forth by treaty. And the treaties will lay out, okay, well, for example, we'll extradite for this, but not for that. Or, for example, we won't extradite if you're going to try to kill the person. There will be sort of ground rules in effect up front. In places where there is not a treaty in effect, whether it's either because the treaty has been suspended or where there's never been an extradition treaty, because there are countries like that too. Or they may have a treaty to extradite to one country but not to another. Those become case-by-case requests. And there are some instances where the extradition where the country asking for the return of a suspect will get a no. There are other times where they'll get a yes, but it's not governed by a set of rules of the road. So if we're trying to get somebody back and there isn't a treaty, what we hope and expect is that the facts of the case and the demonstration of the seriousness of the offense will persuade the country to send the person back to us, even if they don't have, a treaty is basically a law, even if they don't have a law that they've agreed to that says that they would.
All right, Sarah, let's do this real quick. Let's put his face back up there again. David Varela, that's the look of the man that is currently wanted by police. You're looking at him on the right there, accused of murdering his wife. There to the left, Lina Guerra. If you see him, you are asked to call police. If you know at any point where he may have gone or where he could be or any information that can help the case, as you've just been listening to, call the crime line, 1-888-LOCK-YOU-UP. Reach out to your local prosecutors as well, because they are desperately trying to find that man on your screen. Ramin, thank you so much for joining us here today. Anything else you want to leave the people who are watching this or will see it later? Anything else you want to share with them, either about this case or about the new coalition that you all have formed?
I'm really glad for Lina and for her family that a lot of people have been moved by her death and by her killing. The most common crime in the world is domestic violence, and the most underpunished and underreported. We're doing better now than we did 100 years ago when people thought it was just their prerogative to beat their women. We recognize that this is wrong, but these are still immensely difficult cases. What I would hope is that the media attention that has come to this case will both lead to Mr. Varela's arrest so that we can hold him accountable. I would hope that it would also serve as a reminder to family members that they've got family who need help. A reminder to victims of intimate partner violence that you don't have to suffer like this. You think you do because you've been brainwashed, but you don't. That there are resources like the Norfolk Family Justice Center that is available to victims from all over Hampton Roads. It's over across from Costco. It's part of my office, and we have services available. Don't become a statistic. Don't. You deserve better. You deserve better than this treatment. And I also remind people that, for every one of these cases that we're discussing, there are scores of women dead in the ground, and men too, but primarily women, dead in the ground with somebody at large who aren't getting this kind of media attention. And that if anybody has information on homicides or violent crimes that they've been sitting on, please just give it to us. No judgment, just give it to us so that we can hold people accountable, we can provide closure for families, and we can, even if it hasn't escalated to murder, we can try and save people's lives so that they don't have to experience this.
I think that's an excellent way to end this conversation at this point. Norfolk's Commonwealth Attorney Ramin Fatehi, thank you so much for coming in and talking about not only your initiative, but in particular you can hear the desire you have in that to help people who are in similar positions and obviously to solve this case. We appreciate you, sir.
Thank you for having me.